Good morning, everyone. My name is Fernando Herrera. I'm the Assistant Principal of Security here at Grover Cleveland High School. I have been the Assistant Principal here for 18 years. My first year as Assistant Principal was during the 9/11 attacks. I was on the job for 2 weeks when those incidents occurred, when that event occurred. So it was obviously a workday morning around 9 o'clock. And I remember it being one of the bluest days I've ever seen. The sky was so blue, it was absolutely clear. There was not a cloud in the sky. It was an extremely beautiful day. So much so that I had remarked to my colleague, one of my deans, and how beautiful it actually was. So we were outside and had heard at that point, what was a rumor that an airplane had accidentally crashed into the World Trade Center. So everybody thought it was an accident at first. Everybody thought it was a very small airplane. Nobody thought that it was a large airliner. So I went up to the third floor of the building and looked out the window, and from there you could see the World Trade Center, and one of the towers at that point were on fire. And I thought it was odd because if you've ever been to New York City, although the World Trade Center buildings were gigantic, it would be very hard to hit them with an airplane unless you were purposely doing so, purposely trying to do so. So I assumed that perhaps someone had committed suicide by flying a small airplane into the World Trade Center. When I saw the tower, though, there was a lot of smoke. I suspected that it was probably an airplane larger than one of the smaller, two-seater or four-seater airplanes that people use for personal use. So I went about my business of running the school. TVs were on in some of the offices that was showing the fire that was now engulfing the top floors of the World Trade Center, one of the World Trade Center buildings. So shortly after that, we had heard that the second World Trade Center was hit with an airplane and was on fire. So I thought it was a rumor only, and I went to the third floor to look out the window again, and sure enough, both buildings were now on fire. It was evident at that point to anyone with common sense is that this was not an accident, and that this was indeed a terrorist attack on the United States of America. So in between all of that, we also heard that the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C. was hit by an airplane and was on fire at that point. And we could see that on TV. And at some point after that, we had heard that another airplane had either been shot down or was purposely crashed somewhere in either Ohio or Pennsylvania. It turned out to be Pennsylvania and Shanksville. So while all that was going on, we had heard a rumor that one of the buildings had partially collapsed. And again, I went to the third floor. Again, I looked out the window, and sure enough, one of the buildings were missing, and there was a lot of smoke. So it's clear that one of the buildings had fallen. And then shortly after that, the fear was obviously that the last building, the second building, would fall as well. And sure enough, shortly after that, it was reported that the second World Trade Center building had also collapsed. I went to the third floor to try to confirm that, and sure enough, both buildings were gone. So a few things that I remember from that day were as follows. My colleague, Mrs. Garcia, who's the assistant principal of guidance, before the towers had fallen, was walking through a hallway to leave the building to go home, I guess. And it was early in the morning, which I thought was odd, but she looked very, very gray and very upset. Everybody was upset, but she looked particularly upset. I found out later on that her brother Kenneth Leday, worked at the World Trade Center, and she had left to find out, whether or not he made it out okay. The World Trade Center at any point during the day held anywhere from 15,000 to 20,000 people. So, the loss of life that people expected was devastating. So, and her brother was inside, and her brother ultimately perished in the attacks. Kenneth Leday. I remember a lot of students crying, out of confusion, not knowing what was going on, and out of sadness for those who did know what was going on. And speaking about sadness, there was a lot of sadness amongst the adults and people in the building. A lot of anger is what that turned into. Everybody became very angry knowing that these were terrorist attacks that were perpetrated against the United States. Everybody was thinking about how many people would be dead, because as I mentioned, that at any point, anywhere between 15 to 20,000 people worked in those buildings, and we expected, 10,000 people to be dead. Turned out to be almost 3,000 people, probably more now if you would include the fire department personnel and police officers that have died since due to disease from the dust that was poisonous from the buildings that had collapsed. I also remember the confusion initially after the first building was hit of not knowing what was going on. We really didn't know that it was a terrorist attack until the second building was hit, and it became apparent at that point. We were also thinking about people we may have lost, and in the end I did lose a friend. My friend Gerald O'Leary graduated Christ the King High School here in Queens. Together with him, he perished. He was a chef for one of the big companies there, and he perished in the attacks and was never found. I do remember the smell of smoke throughout the city, but not regular smoke, like a chemically kind of smell, and that was throughout the city, and more and more as you got closer to towards Manhattan. Manhattan was shut down. You weren't allowed to go into Manhattan south of Midtown, if anybody knows what Manhattan is. So basically half of Manhattan was closed down at that point. I remember working until about 9 o'clock, 8 or 9 o'clock here at the school that night. I remember schools being closed the next day, if I remember correctly. Came to school with no students. I remember F-15 fighter jets, American fighter jets, screaming over New York City, very, very loud enough to rattle windows, which scared a lot of people. Not me though. I was glad the F-15s were around New York City at that time, because we didn't know what else was coming. We didn't know if more airplanes were hijacked. Moving on, as time, during the event, I remember just seeing people jumping out of windows, holding hands, and jumping out of windows, all together. Some single, some in groups, some one right after the other, nonstop, over and over. So I do remember that as well. Remember one of the news outlets having a camera at the base of the World Trade Center. I remember the sound that those people made as they hit the sidewalk from about 100 floors, after jumping from 100 floors up. So just in the in the time that went on afterwards, I remember babies being born with no fathers, because many of them had perished in the World Trade Center itself. Police officers, firemen, workers, people on the street. So a lot of children born without fathers after 9/11. So now, after all of these years, we see how that has affected the world, and everybody pretty much says that the world changed on that day, and it's very sad that we won't know, not we won't know, you guys won't know, won't ever know what the world was like before that event. So the world can be a very cruel place. It can be bad at times, but I believe it can be mostly good. as well. I believe that the world can be made if you can just make your part of the world better and treat the people around you as good as you can, and love yourselves and love the people around you. The world can be mostly a really good place. So that's my 9/11 story. It was my pleasure to tell it to you guys, and that's pretty much it. So thank you once again. Thank you, Mrs. Jacob, for the opportunity to tell you these things, and that's it. We miss you, Miss Jacob. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.